So welcome everybody. I am David Kahane. I lead Alberta Climate Dialogue, which is a project that's been running for about 4.5 years, funded by one of the federal research councils, which brings university-based researchers at 14 different universities worldwide together with public involvement practitioners, with partners in Alberta who are in NGOs or in government. What we've been trying to do is bring citizens together in really supportive dialogue, deliberation environments to learn about climate change, bring their own perspectives to the table, and ultimately, we hope, influence climate policy. So some of you might have heard of the Citizens Panel on Edmonton's energy and climate challenges. We brought together 57 demographically representative Edmontonians for 6 full days in partnership with the city and the Centre for Public Involvement. They ended up making a quite ambitious set of recommendations to the City of Edmonton about becoming a low-carbon city pretty quickly. And right now, city administration is working with those recommendations along with some other sources of information, and we'll bring something to City Council this fall, we hope. So that's the kind of work that we've been doing in Alberta Climate Dialogue. I want to welcome you on behalf of Alberta Climate Dialogue, the City of Edmonton, the Office of Sustainability at the University of Alberta, and the Alberta Public Interest Research Group to this evening with Eriel Deranger, David Suzuki, and Ian Mauro. I want to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory, to recognize that all of us in Edmonton and in Alberta are beneficiaries of this peace and friendship treaty, and to affirm that dealing with the environmental challenges that we're going to talk about tonight and ensuring a just and successful future for our children, grandchildren, and descendants depends on recognizing and honoring these treaty relationships with Indigenous peoples and nations. So our theme tonight is leadership and how citizens and grassroots people can become leaders in an age of climate disruption. Dealing with climate disruption and all of the issues of justice and environmental degradation that go along with it requires rapid and dramatic changes to mainstream politics, mainstream social practices, mainstream cultures, mainstream economies. And even where governments are stepping up to the challenge, these changes are going to require a lot from us. They're going to require that we connect in new ways to the reality around us, that we change our personal behaviors, that we build resiliency in our communities, and that we mobilize politically. That's all the more true. Why, thank you. Where governments aren't stepping up, and I would suggest that that is true in almost every jurisdiction, and certainly in Alberta and Canada, the responsibility for us as citizens is even more profound. We have to exercise leadership that much more strongly. We need to find new ways of being together and working together. We need to find ways of building the solutions ourselves without waiting for government. We need to find ways of mobilizing to get the changes that we need from governments and from corporations in the face of climate disruption. So I don't know how many of you saw this great article. I thought it was a great article in The Nation yesterday. You can go to thenation.com and read it. It's by Naomi Klein. And she was talking about, and this isn't news, but she put it very eloquently, how facing up to climate change, climate disruption, and responding intelligently doesn't just require big changes out there in the world. It actually requires that we really find new ways of thinking and being ourselves. So part of what she wrote is, what makes climate change so very different for us to grasp, so very difficult for us to grasp, is that ours is a culture of the perpetual present, one that deliberately severs itself from the past that created us, as well as the future we are shaping with our actions. Climate change is about how what we did generations in the past will inescapably affect not just the present, but generations in the future. These time frames are a language that has become foreign to most of us. And she goes on to quote Wendell Berry, the great American ecologist. She said she went up to him after a talk and she said, well, what do people like me do? What do the rootless people do? Give us some advice. And he said, stop somewhere and begin the 1,000-year-long process of knowing that place. So if we're looking for new ways of thinking and being, the new ways that are needed to live with climate change, I think that one of the greatest sources for us is going to be the traditional ways of the original inhabitants of this territory. And so I would like to invite John Erminskin, an elder from Treaty 6, to offer a prayer, and he will be followed by Grand Chief Craig Mackinac of Treaty 6. Thank you, Grand Chief Mackinac. Thank you, John Erminskin. And thank you also to the folks in the Treaty 6 office who helped to arrange for you to be here this evening. With that, I'm going to hand over to Ian Mauro. Ian.
Thanks, David. Hi, everybody. It's great to be in Edmonton, and it's great to be here with all of you tonight talking about some pretty important issues. I am from Manitoba originally, but I spent a lot of time in Alberta growing up, and I would say that the outer regions of Edmonton, just outside of Stony Plain, where our family farm is, and where my grandmother still resides and still farms and gardens, it was a focal point for me for understanding how to interact with the environment. My grandfather, who's pictured here, the farm is on the border of a reserve. They would take me to powwows, and I really got a sense of, the relationship with the land through farming, through interacting with indigenous peoples in this area, and I carried that through to my studies. And so for my PhD work, I studied farmer knowledge and biotechnology in the Canadian prairies, and I got a sense of that rich knowledge of local people from people like my grandparents. And for my PhD work, I was interested in interacting with farmers about their experiences with biotechnology. I ended up making a couple of films because film is this interesting medium where you can have people see the world. You can take them to places. You can have them interact with issues. David Suzuki is the master of that through the nature of things. And I was inspired by that, and I thought that was a really interesting technique. And I ended up meeting David through this work as a geneticist at the forefront of these issues, talking about biotechnology. We crossed paths, and it's a relationship that's led us here tonight. And with respect to my work, I was following up on these themes of local knowledge, and I ended up getting to the Arctic. And the Arctic is where I started to learn about climate change in a real way. And this idea of local knowledge, observing things, the elders see things over 90 years, over a lifetime, over oral history, over generations, over centuries and millennia through storytelling. And I got to the Arctic, and I first went there as a student. I went back teaching, and this is Deborah Kanak in Igloolik. I'm in an igloo at the return of the sun. The changes there are profound, and the Arctic is the canary in the coal mine, if you will. And through that process of living in the Arctic, meeting elders, learning to speak Inuktitut, not as well as Kiwi Martin, who's at the University of Alberta here, who's here tonight, who spent a lot of time up north with me as well. I ended up meeting Zacharias Kunuk, who's the renowned Inuit filmmaker who made Atanadjuat the Fast Runner. And Zach and I'm an environmental scientist by training, this weird kind of scientist that speaks partial Inuktitut, and we started to collaborate on a project, and it ended up being this film, Kaperangayuk, Inuit Knowledge and Climate Change, documenting the knowledge of elders in the Arctic. And that film you can watch online. If you Google Inuit Knowledge and Climate Change or go to this link, you can see it. This is something I encourage you to check out. It's another place where we can start to identify and see the changes and use the power of film to interact with an environment that you might not necessarily get to, but that you can certainly start to understand. And this is the world's first Inuktitut language film, so it's actually in the language of the elders. Many of these elders have passed on, and so we were fortunate enough to document them. And the power of film is also giving the knowledge of these knowledge holders, letting them retain it, not extracting it, putting it in text, writing it as a paper, and getting a journal article with your name on it. It's the elders in the film, their knowledge, they hold it, they speak it through their words on video. And this project of documenting climate change over Canada, in the Royal Ontario Museum, I had a recent exhibit, and I'm going to show you some photos that take you there. This is a photo of Luki Erut. This is a 70-year-old elder hunting on an ice floe 2 years ago. This is a photo that I called 1,000 years ago today. He's holding a jerry can as a float. Traditionally, that would be an avatak. That would be a sealskin ball sewn to be waterproof that is afloat so that when you harpoon an animal, it holds that animal at the surface until you can hunt it and take it for food. This is still happening in the Arctic. This is the way of life in the Arctic. There's modernization, there's stores, there's all kinds of things, but people are still living like this. These people, as mentioned, the elders, retaining this knowledge, it's alive and well all over all over Canada, and something that we can certainly tap into. You look at the sea ice here. The Arctic is warming double the global average. We're looking at losing summer sea ice within our lifetimes. This is unfathomable change, and change linked to culture. This is Luki. He's also a master carver, and he's carving the summer months of Inuit life on one tusk of the walrus and the winter months and lifestyle on the other tusk. And so you see this kind of intimate interaction between life, culture, and environment. This is another elder from Pangnirtung. This man's name is Inusik Nashilik, and he's the oldest man in Pangnirtung. He's 94 now, 93, 94. And in the film, he tells stories about how icebergs are alive, that the environment has sentience, and that these icebergs can navigate and steer the course of their own trajectory. But increasingly, these icebergs are less and less arriving in their community. And if you question this idea of an iceberg alive, I was in Cumberland Sound, and I'm a scientist, I shouldn't be talking about icebergs being alive, but I saw this. And this is a huge piece of ice, an iceberg, and on the center of it, it's a human-like form. If you zoom in and you actually take a look at this, it's almost like a human meditating over a rock. There's a rock there that somehow, glacial till got onto this thing, and there's almost little angel wings coming off the back of this thing. And when I saw it, it just blew me away. We're losing this kind of sentience of the environment as it becomes degraded, and it's something that we should all be thinking about. The Arctic is really part of our global home. Issues of food security, young people struggling in these areas, the elders' mention of youth, this is what this is about. Resilience, and how we find resilience. This is a young guy creating fun in his own neighborhood, driving this tricycle into a mattress and flying through the air. And you look at the creativity of young people and how there's hope and resilience in all these kinds of avenues and activities. And yet we're at this tipping point. The environment is changing. The Arctic, they talk about tipping points. We're also at this societal tipping point. We're at a place where we really, really need to make some decisions. And in the context of the Arctic, Silawat Kluche, some of you may have heard of her. She got nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize along with Al Gore for linking climate change and human rights, saying that this is an issue that affects human beings. This is an issue that affects cultures. This is a human rights issue. And so my work is interested in linking kind of human systems, seeing that human face of climate change. But if you haven't seen it, the IPCC just released a new report. We're looking at a global mean temperature increase in the next century of 4 degrees. If you take a look at the Arctic, it could be upwards of 11 degrees Celsius. This is unreal. This is going to change everything that we know about our environment. But it's going to affect the globe, not just the Arctic. If you take a look at these images, anybody know where these are from? New York City. The top right is ground zero at Hurricane Sandy time. This is ground zero of climate change. We're seeing these impacts all over the world, and we're seeing them in your own backyard. You guys know better than anywhere, Calgary. This is serious stuff. This is hitting every community. I pulled these images off the internet. Live your dream. We got young kids and old people struggling to get out and into safety. We have to really evaluate our dreams, evaluate our future. And this film, Climate Change in Atlantic Canada, this is part of the ROM exhibit. We had a photo exhibit. The website is up, the trailer is there. We traveled across Atlantic Canada and interviewed 107 people about their experiences with climate change, trying to get on the local level, trying to see it, but also create a product that was regionally specific, so to engage local people in a dialogue with local people about their own area. And so we're interested in these kind of regionally specific communication tools to engage people in a dialogue about what they can do at home. When I showed it to David, amazing, so indebted to him, he said, let's take this thing on the road. And so we've been touring it around Canada. We were in Halifax, St. John's, Charlottetown, and Moncton. And in every venue, we've tried to engage the First Nations people, asking them to come on board, give us guidance, help us to reconnect. And so I want to thank everybody for being here today. I want to thank David again for offering this opportunity. We're going west now, so we're going here today, tomorrow in Calgary, and Thursday in Vancouver, and that will be the Western Canadian tour. But tonight, we're in Edmonton. And tonight, we have with us David Suzuki, a world-famous geneticist, somebody who's entered our imagination at a very young age, completely redefined the course of what I could do as an environmental scientist, and redefined, our relationship with our country, and helping us to see the world that we live in and how we can create a positive contribution to it. He's a co-founder of the David Suzuki Foundation, and he's right here with us tonight, so I want to welcome David Suzuki, and I would encourage you to help me with that. Thanks, David.
Wow. Great audience. Thank you all for coming out tonight. It's great to see you all here, and I hope you've all paid money so that it'll support the two local groups that were mentioned. I too would like to add my recognition, acknowledgement that long before Europeans ever came to this territory, it belonged to the First Nations who had been here for thousands of years. I'm really delighted to see the invitation of the First Nations to open this meeting and to provide you from the Elder with some insight on First Nations views of the world. I thought I threw out the notes I had because I've been struggling a great deal with the role of First Nations in Canada today. I gave a speech that was reported in the Vancouver Sun by the environmental reporter Larry Pinn, a guy I like a lot. I respect his work. But in his article, he said, well, people like Suzuki think Indians have just a genetic, innate response to the environment and a love of the environment, which is just a ridiculous statement. And I took him on about this. I said, look, First Nations around the world are human beings like all of us. The studies in my field of genetics indicate that human beings originated as a species in Africa 150,000 years ago. And then as they built up a population, they moved. No doubt there are a lot of young guys that wanted to get some action, so they wanted adventure. Anyway, for whatever reasons, they began to move. And as they moved, over time, they moved into new territory. They didn't know anything about the ecology of the area. And the records now are very clear. Human beings slaughtered and rendered extinct a lot of the animals as they moved. When Paleolithic man squirted into North America, you can see the big animals, the giant sloths, the mammoths that disappeared as human beings spread. Even with stone axes and spears, human beings were able to take the big, slow-moving, meaty prey and extinguish a lot of them. And so what happened over time is people either went, oh God, we've screwed it up now, there are no birds to kill or whatever, and they either moved on or people began to live and try to live in a greater harmony with the area that was supporting them. And so that's been the tradition. We've established populations all over the world as we moved, and we also occupied the entire planet. What we have in indigenous knowledge is not something that is a genetic love of nature and appreciation. They live with hard-won lessons that their ancestors taught them. These were lessons in failures and successes that they passed on because they were oral traditions. And they accumulated literally over thousands of years what we now come to understand as indigenous knowledge. And that knowledge is profound beyond anything science could ever duplicate. The great tragedy of our time today is not only the extinction of other species, but the incredible rate of extinction of entire cultures. Because in those cultures are thousands of years as I say, of hard-won lessons. And when they disappear, they're gone forever. So I've been thinking a lot about this, and I think back on my grandparents. My grandparents came from Japan in 1904 to 1906. They left Japan because they were poor, and they heard there were opportunities in Canada. My mother was born in Vancouver in 1911. My father was born in Vancouver in 1909. And like all of the other Japanese Canadian kids born in Canada at that time, they had no grandparents. They had no elders. They were all left in Japan. They were rootless. And when you think of the colonizing countries that went around the world, whether Australia, New Zealand, Africa, the Arctic, South America, it's all the same. The colonizers came in. They had the first generation of newborn. They had no roots in the old country, no roots in this new country. And so they brought with them a very different way of looking at the land. You heard from our elder, the land is sacred in their culture. But my grandparents came, and to them, land was opportunity. You work your ass off to make some money. You buy land. If there are trees on it, cut them down and sell them. If there are fish on it, catch them and sell them. If there are minerals on the land, dig it up and sell them. Once the land is developed, you sell it and move away. That attitude, I believe, is the dominant attitude now that has occupied virtually the entire planet. We don't have that attachment and understanding of land that comes from thousands of years of belonging to that place. We see it simply as opportunity. And that, I believe, is the great crisis that we face now, is the clash between these two ways of seeing the world, seeing our place in it. And some of you may have seen the article in Maclean's in which I say that despite the enormous success of the first 2 decades of the environmental movement, we're losing big time. And the loss is that we haven't understood the message that is coming from First Nations, that we're not seeing that it's about the way that we live on this land. And it's interesting, you know, there are 9 communities on the west coast of British Columbia through which Northern Enbridge wants to push their pipeline. Now, my wife and I, for years, have spent time going into these 9 communities. And in every one, the first thing they say is, we're poor. We need jobs. We need community economic development. And that's what we have been working with for years, a program called PAR, Participatory Action Research, that was very well developed at the University of Calgary, working to try to create small local jobs to keep the money in the communities. You can bet that Enbridge and our government have offered these 9 coastal communities millions of dollars just to sign on the line. And they are absolutely adamant that those pipelines will not go through. And our government isn't getting the message. So the latest thing is Jim Prentice, a guy I really respect, has now been seconded to go in and try to talk to those Indigenous people. He's got a good relationship. And I emailed Jim and I said, Jim, it's not about money. You're not going to buy them off. It's about our relationship with the land. And that's what we have to understand, is that message of our relationship with the land is one of the greatest gifts that we could get from the First Nations people. Despite all we've done, they've hung on to their culture and they're willing to share it with us. What an enormous gift that is. So I'm honored to be here. I'm honored to have you here with us. I open all of my talks now by saying I'm not here to speak on behalf of any organization or any group of people. I got my foundation into a lot of trouble by shooting off my mouth and getting our foundation audited by our government. We're now in our third audit, and this isn't a trivial exercise. It's a very, very punitive activity, and it's very expensive. So I've had to step off the board of my foundation, and I speak to you as an individual, but I speak primarily as an elder. And I believe this is the most important time of my life. You see, elders are unlike any other group in society. We're past it now. We're not ambitious or running after more fame or money or power. Now, I know there are some old guys that are still trying to do that. They need help. They got problems. We're past that, so that we're now freed from that stuff. We can speak truth that comes from the heart. And I see that as my role today. Because as an elder, again, we've got something nobody else here has. As elders, we've lived an entire lifetime. We've made mistakes, at least you may not have, but I have. We've celebrated a few successes and victories, and we've had failures. We've learned a lot. And so I find that I'm spending my time trolling through that lifetime I've lived for the most important thing I could do for future generations, to find out nuggets of lessons I've learned, to try to pass it on to the coming generation. So I speak a lot to young people like the audience here. I'm at your back, as I hope are all of the elders in this society. Before we go to Ian's very, very important film, when he sent it to me, I looked at it and I said, we're spending all of our time still arguing about whether climate change is happening. Look at this film. These are ordinary people, but they're people who live with weather and climate. And anyone that says climate change isn't real or isn't happening is just not paying attention. So this is, to me, a very, very important film. But I wanted to give you a bit of history that gives me, certainly as an elder, a strong sense of urgency. Scientists have known the physics of climate change for over 150 years. They discovered global warming through the properties of molecules like water, like methane and carbon dioxide. They discovered that in the 19th century. And they talked about, could this be something that affects climate on a grand scale? And by the 20th century, we knew that there was a possibility that more greenhouse gases would actually change the temperature on the planet. And from planetary studies, we knew if you don't have an atmosphere, we needed greenhouse gases. We needed that in order to make it livable for life. If you go to Mars, which has a very weak atmosphere, from the daytime, you go from boiling temperatures on the land to absolutely frigid, freezing temperatures at nighttime because temperature just fluctuates. There's nothing to hold the heat from the day over into night. That's what our blanket of greenhouse gases has done for us on this planet, to hold the heat and ameliorate the extremes of daytime heat and nighttime heat. And so it's nice and comfy for animals like us to flourish in. If you go to a planet like Venus, which is shrouded in a constant cloud of water vapor, the temperature on the surface, we now know, is over 500 degrees Celsius. So we've been very lucky with the balance of greenhouse gases and the temperature we've lived within. The reality is that we know there is a gigantic spike of carbon dioxide that's unprecedented in the last over 150,000 years, and that this is being amplified by now what's happening with the huge spike in methane release. We used to say that it came from cow farts, which it does, but now there's a huge amount of escape coming from fracking wells that you get escape, and a lot of that, 7 to 9% of that, is methane, which is 21 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So we know the evidence is very clear. Humans have become so powerful, we are actually changing the chemistry of the atmosphere. Just wanted to say that, I knew of global warming in the 1980s, but I used to refer to it as a slow motion catastrophe. I was more focused on issues like deforestation, ocean depletion, and we were fighting. I thought that we had decades to play around with getting our carbon emissions reduced. And it wasn't until 1988, which to me was an absolutely critical year, not just for me, but for the world. 1988, I was invited to Australia for the first time in my life because they had just set up a non-governmental organization called the Commission for the Future. So there's a government-funded body to look at the science that tells us what the future holds for us. And they invited me to come and talk, and they showed me the evidence about our contribution of greenhouse gases. And I came back to Canada saying, this is not a slow-motion catastrophe. We've got to start doing something now. That year, in fact, the environment had reached an absolute peak everywhere in the world. Margaret Thatcher was filmed picking up litter in Hyde Park, and she turned to camera and said, well, I'm a greenie too. In 1988, a guy ran for president of the United States and said, you elect me, I promise I will be an environmental president. His name was George H.W. Bush. He didn't have a green bone in his body, but he said it because American people had put the environment at the absolute peak. 1988, Brian Mulroney was re-elected prime minister. To show he cared about the environment, he appointed his brightest star as the minister of the environment. Anyone know who that was? Elizabeth May, I wish. Lucien Bouchard. And I interviewed Lucien Bouchard 3 months after he was made the minister, and I said, Mr. Bouchard, what is the most important issue facing Canadians? Right away, he said, global warming. So I said, wow, how serious is it? And these are his exact words. It threatens the survival of our species. We have to act now. 1988, there was a conference of climatologist Ken Hare at the University of Toronto called this conference. Stephen Lewis told me that Mulroney asked Stephen to chair a number of the sessions at this meeting. Climatologists were convinced the evidence was in. Humans were causing global warming. And they issued a press release at the end of the conference saying this represented a threat to human survival, second only to nuclear war. And they called for a 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in 15 years. Think if we had paid attention. The politicians had got it, the public had put the environment up there, and the scientists had issued a call. If we had met that target, and it was easily achievable, if we had made that our target and achieved it, we'd already be way past the Kyoto targets. But we didn't. And then I was going to go into a long, sorry history of what's happened since. But since Mr. Harper has got in, it's very, very clear the climate is not on his agenda. He canceled all of the programs that the previous Liberal government had instigated to try to make the commitment to Kyoto. And he said, we're not going to try to reduce emissions because it interferes with economic development. Now, he then, of course, eventually stepped out of the Kyoto Protocol altogether, the only country in the world to step out of something they'd already committed to. I keep saying Mr. Chrétien ratified the Kyoto Protocol, not as a Liberal, but as my Prime Minister. He committed Canada to the Kyoto Protocol. Mr. Harper was elected on a law and order agenda. Remember that? And yet he thinks that international law is something you can opt out of any time. It's quite a contrast. But it's very clear that the issue of climate change interferes with the vision of developing Canada as a petropower. Now, I would have thought, energy has got to be at the center of our long-term planning. Clearly, energy, the kind of energy we have, the energy direction we go, is absolutely critical in the coming years. You cannot have a serious energy strategy if you don't include the possible effects of the burning of fossil fuels. The Harper government we don't want to hear about it, cancel all of those trips, those study trips to the Arctic because that's where it's already going on. Cancel the experimental lakes area because that's finding out too much about what it's doing to fresh water. Shut down the libraries of DFO, burn some of the books, fire a fifth of the scientists working for Environment Canada, and muzzle those that remain and vet their studies through government lenses. And it's just astonishing. Those damned enviros making a lot of trouble, well, demonize them. They're enemies of Canada. We're linked with terrorists, with Osama bin Laden. We're told by the Minister of the Environment, Peter Kent, that environmental groups are taking foreign money and laundering it for these foreign groups to run on a foreign agenda. all designed, and some of you may have heard that yesterday, one of the problems with the proposed pipeline to Kitimat is those supertankers are going to represent a threat to humpback whales, which are endangered. So the solution, great solution, take them off the endangered list. No longer a problem. It's an astonishing way of dealing with this. And, you know, it infuriates me because whatever is done or not done in the next few years, going to have very little effect on my life. I'm at the end of my life. But it's going to reverberate through the lives of all of you young people here. Your lives are going to live with the consequences of it. It's too important an issue not to go and vote, not to be part of the electoral process. So I challenge you, we've got to take back democracy and take back your concerns and put it on the agenda. So, thank you. Edmonton, I love you. Thank you very much. We'll have a talk after the film.
So, turning to the last part of our evening, I want to turn in this last part to this question of leadership and citizens as climate leaders. Those of you who, especially those of you who U of A, will realize that the language of leadership is very much in the air here right now. Senior administrators at the university are putting their heads together and building the Peter Lougheed Leadership College, the Peter Lougheed Leadership Initiative, Residential College just a little ways down Saskatchewan Drive that will house 150 students. Our president has talked about global gatherings. She's invoked Davos. And so we're somehow going to be forming new kinds of leaders. Here at the University of Alberta, Kim Campbell, the former Conservative Prime Minister of Canada, is going to be the inaugural principal of this institution. And your tax dollars will be supporting it through the provincial government to the tune of $35 million over the next 7 years. There are also a lot of private donors lined up who are contributing money and helping to shape the college. So the big question looming over all of this is, what kind of leadership do we need? Right? What does leadership look like in an age of climate change? Do we look to the people at the top of the leadership pyramids we have now, be they provincial government, federal government, corporations, University of Alberta? Do we want more leaders like that? Are those the leaders who are actually going to help us through the deepest challenges that we face? Do we need more people who can lead like those people lead? Or are there other visions of leadership that might be helpful in bringing more than the usual power holders together, in connecting in new ways with the world around us, in building holistic understandings of our toughest challenges, and in transforming our communities to build a saner, less destructive, and more resilient world? I believe that's called a rhetorical question. So I'm going to kick us off with two questions to our panelists, and then I'd invite you to step in. There'll be mics traveling around the room, and you can ask your own questions, perhaps relating to this question of leadership. But the first question I want to pose, and maybe we can just go down from David through to Eriel, is what kinds of leadership do we actually need in an age of climate change?
Well, the problem is the game that we have to play, our leaders play in. When you play the game of politics, you have to play within the rules set by that politics. Children don't vote. When someone is elected to office, the very first priority they have is when is the next election, because that allows you to focus on the one group that will vote and possibly get you in for a second term. So that short-term thinking is built into the political system that we have. And then you think of the sense of obligation that those politicians have to the various funders, the people that support them in their campaign. And it's not an accident that corporations have the clout to provide support for political candidates and get first entry into their door when they're elected. I would say from my standpoint in Canada, one of the biggest challenges we face is that we've got a very defective system of democracy. My mother and father, like all other Asian Canadians, although they're born and raised in Canada, couldn't vote until after the end of World War II. And African Canadians couldn't vote, First Nations couldn't vote, and as you know, women couldn't vote they had to acquire that. So democracy is something that is very slowly acquired over time. Because my parents had grown up without the vote, I take the right to vote very, very seriously. I have voted in every federal election. I have never voted for a party that got into power. So basically, for 55 years, my vote has been wasted. We have a first past the post system where we can have a government with 38, 39% of the vote. So I really think the challenge is to take back democracy. More people who don't normally get out and vote or raise hell at all candidates' meetings have got to get out there and take back that democracy.
I had mentioned Chipewyan Kluche in my kind of preamble, and your question kind of prompts me to think about her, and she often thinks about and talks about leadership from the heart. And I think that's a really important part of this. And the Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman, is that his name? Yeah, he recently had an op-ed in the New York Times a couple days ago, and he was reflecting on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports that the latest ones have come out, 3 of them in the past couple months. And the last one basically said, we have the technology to sort this out. We have an economy that actually wouldn't be that adversely impacted. And so the economists were looking at this and saying, you know what, where climate change, practices and mitigation and things are put into place, we're not going to actually lose our quality of life over becoming environmentally sustainable. And this kind of crossroads between environment and economy is a false one, he was arguing. This is a Nobel Prize-winning economist. And at the end of his op-ed, he basically said, everything is set in motion to deal with this issue, and the only thing stopping us is ignorance, vested interests, and prejudice. And so we're at a time where leadership of the heart, us as individuals standing up to these things that we can deal with. If those are the real challenges, those are challenges within us. Those are challenges within our communities. Those are challenges within society that we need to grapple with. It's just not politicians. It's also us getting a handle on the type of world that we want to see. And in a place like Alberta, talking about leadership, talking about a leadership institute or whatever it's called, this issue of vested interests. And, there's a lot of power in places where it shouldn't necessarily be. And that power steers us to certain objectives that we don't necessarily want. And it comes to our confidence and it comes to our leadership of the heart to say, no, that's not the world that we want. We want a different world. And I think that starts, an argument towards the grassroots, us really starting to mobilize. Obviously, we need political leadership from the top, but we can't wait for that. We have to start mobilizing and creating the communities that we want now.
I guess, first off, it's really interesting to be involved in climate change dialogue, because when I first started my work, I didn't get involved in this because I was an environmentalist or even an activist, but I was an indigenous rights advocate. I was trying to protect my people and my people's lands and territory, and I remember going to Copenhagen in 2009 and someone saying to me that you're at the heart of the conversations around climate change. The tar sands is one of the biggest beasts. And I was like, whoa. This kind of really overwhelming sense of understanding that place where I was. And I began to see that even though I was so small, that I was a big part of a bigger picture and this bigger dialogue that needed to happen. And what it really made me feel is that we have to give voice to all of those people, the people in these videos, the people in the communities that are feeling and experiencing the direct impacts of out-of-control fossil fuel development and the impacts of climate change across the globe. And so when I think about what kind of leadership do we need, it's more about building the bridges to create real leaders. Because I feel like the current leadership that we have in power has missed the point of what it means to lead a country or lead their people. We are losing sight of who we are and where we've come from. You know, David talked about how we don't have roots. Or, well, I do. Sorry guys. I also use a lot of humor to break up my really serious stuff. But, you know, a lot of us have lost that touch and our identity and where we've come from. And I think a part of regaining and having real, true leadership is re-identifying with who we are as a species and the symbiotic nature and relationship that we have with Mother Earth, with this planet. And until we build those bridges back to who we are and where we've come from, and with those people that still have that connection, we are constantly going to continue to trip over ourselves and fail. So I think for me, real leadership and understanding climate change and how to address climate change, it's about building bridges between the grassroots and the top of the chain, whether it be government and state leaderships or not.
It's interesting that none of us actually address the issue of the kind of leadership. And I think that's indicative. The most important thing is that the power of the change has got to be driven by grassroots. And then the leaders do what we tell them we're electing them to that position to do. So it's got to be from an empowered grassroots.
So we've heard about leadership connected to grassroots. I might even call that empowered grassroots a kind of leadership. We've heard about leadership with heart, leadership with roots. And I just wonder, and here I'm thinking very much of this leadership college that $35 million of your tax dollars will be supporting. What experiences, what training, what circumstances allow people to step into those kinds of leadership? If you were imagining, all right, well, 150 students, a lot of money, you could give them any experiences you wanted, what would you want to give those young people to help them step into this kind of leadership? And you might even reflect on what's helped you to step into that kind of leadership in your own life.
My position is that the most important thing is not identifying leaders and training them up the right way. It's how do they see their place in the world. So if there's a university like that being built, I would say, let's get down to very simple facts. We live in a world that is shaped by laws of nature. And those are immutable. There's nothing, you have to live within them. In physics, we know you can't build a rocket faster than the speed of light. We know that the law of gravity means you can't build an anti-gravity machine on Earth. The first and second law of thermodynamics means you can't build a perpetual motion machine. We know that. The only people that think they can do better are science fiction writers. But I mean, we know that's the world we live in. In chemistry, we know there are laws that regulate the kinds of molecules you can synthesize, the rate at which reactions take place. We know what the limits are in chemistry, and in biology, it's the same. And this is a part where I think it's really important to remember that we are animals. And right now, we seem so bloody puffed up with ourselves. I just had dinner with my brother-in-law, who's a big-name professor in biochemistry at UBC. Oh, man, technology is just moving so fast, like it's just going to take over. Like he's just so puffed up with how bright we are. And there's no sense of the fact that if you don't have air for more than 4 minutes, you're dead. If you have to breathe polluted air, you're sick. So surely the highest priority in however the way we live has got to be to protect clean air. And you can construct all our basic biological, social, and spiritual needs. And that's the basis on which we then train leaders. But so long as they're stuck in the same old, I'm sorry, I'm going on too long, but I joined with a Lytton Indian band many years ago because the BC government had given Fletcher Challenge, a New Zealand logging company, a permit to log the Stein Valley, which the Lytton people felt was their valley and it was sacred, and they didn't want any logging. And so they said, would you help us fight to protect it? And I said, well, I first have to see what it is, so let me go camping with my family, and I did, and it's a sensational valley. And as we were coming out to the trailhead, after 5 days camping in there, we met a party of people, and the women were in high heels and dresses, and the men were in suits. So I knew these weren't campers, but very quickly you begin to talk because you're on the trail. And very quickly, I realized, oh my God, this is the CEO of Fletcher Challenge. And he very quickly realized, oh my God, this is that shit disturber, David Suzuki. And so very, very quickly we got into this unbelievable argument, and he finally said, listen, Suzuki, tree huggers like you willing to pay to protect those trees? Because if you don't pay to protect them, they only have value when we cut them down. And that was an incredible moment for me, because I realized as long as we argue in his frame, we're screwed. Because if we have to keep arguing economic value of preserving them versus not preserving them, he can argue about the jobs, the board feet of lumber, the volume of pulp, the amount of profit. He can talk about, and what am I left with? Well, we might be able to find some berries every year, and we might get some salal flowers and put them in with florist arrangements, and maybe we can, if we wait long enough, find a cure for cancer. But the important things the forest is doing that we're fighting for aren't in the economic equation. That forest, as long as it's healthy, is taking carbon out of the air and putting oxygen back. Not a bad service for an animal like us. Is there an economist here? You economists can tell us, what do you call it? An externality. They don't give a shit about that. It's not in the, and all of the things that living, healthy forest does are ignored by economics. And so long as we keep raising this economic thing, and it's not a force of nature, we invented it. If it doesn't work, let's change it. Instead, we act as if the economy is, we have to bow down. Oh man, the economy's not looking too healthy today. And we start getting really worried. We invented it, for God's sake. If it's not working, change it. But don't start saying, well, you got to sacrifice. You got to sacrifice your social services for the sake of the economy. We're ending up serving this damn thing that we invented to serve us, and we're now its servants. So let's get things straight. And if we're not going to go into that kind of a discussion, forget it. I'm not interested in that leadership college.
Lucky me, I get to go after David Suzuki. You know, the first thing that I think of when you ask that question is I think about my kids. And I have a 4.5-year-old, and when I say to her, what does David Suzuki say? She says, get those kids outside. And I'm trained as an environmental scientist, and I spent most of my academic career in a room with 4 walls, a roof, and a ceiling. And there's something fundamentally wrong about the way that we train people in a university environment when we're talking about the environment, because it's completely detached or largely detached from those things that David is talking about and the things that are of value. And that leads to externalities because we're just not seeing the connections because we're not part of them. And so, you know, getting outside as education is critical, but in that context, I think about my kids and I think about the type of world that they imagine for themselves. And I think about the lack of detachment, the detachment that we have to young people when we grow up. You know, all of a sudden you're 25 and you've got a kid and you have to think like a kid for the first time in your whole life. And, you know, bringing it back to those children is really, really important. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about these future generations. And I've learned a lot from the Inuit. The Inuit believe in reincarnation. And so when you have elder die in the community, they pass that name on to newborn. And that newborn becomes that elder ostensibly, effectively. And what it means is you wouldn't spank your child because you would be spanking your elder. It means that you wouldn't disrespect the future world of the children because you're disrespecting your elders. And I think that we need a way of thinking that truly respects and understands the life of the child and the future of these children. And if we continue to operate, in this, mid-20s leadership style where it's burn everything and have a good time and party, then we're in a lot of trouble because we're not thinking about those future generations. And so bringing it back to being outside and that future life is really critical.
Ditto. This is like getting the tail end of this is really hard. I really agree with everything that they've said. I mean, it's about getting your hands dirty. I think that real training is getting outside, getting your hands dirty. This summer I'm getting an intern from Princeton University. I work with the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, and we've been fighting the development in northern Alberta in the tar sands. And I was on a speaking tour I was at Harvard, speaking at Harvard, and this student comes up to me and she's just like, I'm an environmental anthropologist. And I'm like, I didn't know those existed. And she said, I've learned lots in books, but I have no idea what it's like to be out in the field, and I really want to come work with you. And I said, all right. And it kind of just hit me that we have all these people that are getting these really great educations and, studying environmentalism in an anthropological way and things that I didn't know actually even existed. And it was really surprising to me because for me, getting outside, getting my hands dirty, being a part of all of that was just something I was raised with. I was raised to understand that the animals, the bears, the eagles, the moose, the caribou, the muskrat, the waterfowl, the fish, they were my ancestors, they were my cousins, they were my relatives, and that I should revere them with that and treat them with that respect. And that the water and the air and the trees and the plants provided for us the medicines and the things that we needed. And growing up with that as just the foundation of who I am and where I came from, just set me off on a different trajectory on how I treated the world around me, how I had that symbiotic relationship with Mother Earth. And it was so strange to become an adult and realize that that is just not a common thing. And I think that that's where we need to go back to. How do we begin to teach those things? And it starts with our children. And I have children too, and I try to do this as much as I can. Teaching your kids how to build a fire, teaching them how to chop wood, teaching them how to plant food and where their food comes from. These are absolutely imperative for the survival of our species. I think technology is going to help us get there, but technology is not going to save us. Technology has been one of the things that has removed us so much from who we are and where we've come from. So I think we need to figure out ways to take these two different worlds, because I've done it, I feel like I have, and put them together and try and make them work for the betterment of our future generations. Because I want my children to be able to go to the Athabasca Delta. I want my children to know what a moose looks like, what a bear looks like. I want them to know that those are their cousins and their relatives and their ancestors. And so I think when we talk about what kind of training we need, it's about getting back outside. We need to take our people, our children, and we need to get them back outside and get their hands dirty.
Hi, my name is Tim Southernwood, and the question about leadership is a curious one. We seek leaders from people whose best interests are re-election. They're not really interested in leading us, but preserving their jobs. And so what we've heard from are real leaders, people who really care about the earth and about continuation of society. So this really is a rhetorical question. But how do we regain the leadership of ourselves, like this gentleman here, who teaches us how to respect the earth, How do we regain that power?
I think that it's a process, and I don't think that there's a one solution for anyone, because I think it's where you come from, and I think that there are definitely teachers in all the communities across the globe, and a lot of these people are the indigenous cultures and the indigenous people. And I think that's because we have maintained that connection to that land. We have those roots that are so entrenched in those areas, and just because you're not from there doesn't mean that you can't learn. And I think regaining our power is regaining our connection with Mother Earth. And I think it's a lifelong process. I don't, like for me, like I said, it was the foundation of who I was growing up, and many people have asked me this question, so how do I, as someone who didn't grow up with that, how do I get that? And I'm like, you just need to talk to those people that have that connection. Spend time outside. Spend time getting to know where you are and where you come from. And we all come from this planet. And I think once we recognize that and you take hold of it and you really believe it and digest it, taking the steps to protect this planet becomes so much easier. It becomes like breathing, because you want to be able to breathe. And in order to do that, we need to have a healthy ecosystem. And we are a part of that ecosystem. You know, earlier, our elder was telling us about how you know, they would hunt moose or caribou and or deer, and they would leave carcasses, parts of the carcass, for the wolves and for the birds. Because even though they could use every part of it, that we are a part of this cycle of life. And somehow we've forgotten that because we have iPhones and cell phone computers that we're not somehow disconnected from it. It's about reconnecting with who we are on this very finite, resourced planet and learning how to get back into that system of the cycle of life.
I can add to that. I think one of the stabilizing factors is strong family and strong communities that hold you in its place. I was brought up as an only son in a Japanese family with 3 sisters, and I was treated like the cat's ass. I was like, you know, Mr. Prince in the family. But that doesn't mean I strutted around. I had an enormous responsibility. I had to do as well as I could because that's what my parents expected of me. And I had to not bring shame on them. Now, the values that I was brought up with were shaped by the Great Depression. My parents became adults during the 1930s in the Great Depression. So the kind of values they kept repeating over and over is, you know, you don't run after money as if somehow that makes you a more important person. You got to save some for tomorrow. Live within your means. Help your neighbors. You may one day need their help. I mean, it was these kinds of phrases were just repeated over and over again. You are what you do, not what you say. But I think, and when I look at First Nations, the sense of community, if people are really grounded in that community, they feel a very strong sense of responsibility to that community. And that stabilizes things, I think. The problem we have is we've exploded in the dominant society, families and communities. And now it's a cult of individualism. And, you know, it's all about our own ego. And I think that's a part of the problem. We don't have a place. We don't have a family to belong to. We don't have a community to belong to. We're all out looking out for ourselves. And I think the kind of economic system we bought into was deliberately created by the Great Depression. The Depression was a terrible, terrible thing. People suffered during that time. What got us out of the Depression was World War II. Wars are great. You produce tanks and guns and planes and people have jobs. It's great. At the end of the war, the president realized, oh my God, we're going to win it. What do we do in peacetime? So he set up the Council of Economic Advisors to the president and said, well, how do we transition from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy? And their answer was consumption. Make Americans worship at the altar of consumption. Get them to buy things, use them up, throw them away, and buy more. And it worked. 70% of the North American economy is based on consumption. But unlike when my parents taught me you need money to buy the things you need, now it's you need money to buy the things you want. Well, there's no end to what you want. And so we get this lavish society within which we live, where we demand a new iPod every year and new laptop every 2 years, and it's crazy.
My name's Richard Mary. There's probably a couple of people in the audience that know me anyways, but I've been what I consider to be a leader in environmental matters over the last 20 years, particularly since the 1994 IPCC report, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, of course. And, I don't have so much of a question, although I had hoped to ask Dr. Suzuki about, whether or not the Northern Gateway pipeline will die.
I don't think there's a chance in hell that the Northern Gateway will go through.
Very good. I wonder how this theme of leadership came up, because I think it's exceptionally important. People like me will never stop fighting these battles. I've pretty much given a large part of my life to this, and it's been very costly. I've done energy work and activism where possible, but it's been somewhat costly on a personal level. So I'm really glad that you're doing this, taking this theme on. And my hope is that people that are a bit younger than me will be taking this on, so to a much greater extent.
These are your successors. These are the kind of people that are going to carry on for you. So don't, yes, it's been a tough road to be an environmentalist, but don't despair that you've not had an impact, because I believe that it all goes towards the next generation.
Hi, my name is Brian Dupuis. I'm interested in skills needed to become leaders in the coming future. And the one that I think I can learn from you at this panel is in your role as communicators. You brought up many potential barriers to reaching the people that are currently obstructing movement forward on climate issues in particular, and sustainability at a broader level. Issues such as ignorance and prejudice and economically biased thinking. What skills as communicators would you suggest we learn to break through those psychological barriers so that these points can reach the people that are currently standing between us and our future?
Well, if you intend to try to do it through standard television channels, forget it. For me, a wonderful thing called public broadcasting. The pressures on public broadcasting are enormous. These are not just cutting away fat now, they're amputations of whole programs. Believe me, I cannot say on television now what I used to say 20 years ago. The fear of litigation, the fear of government retaliation is so enormous. Now, there is a whole other area that's opened up, but I'm a total foreigner in that area, and that's the internet and all of the means of communication that young people just take for granted. That's a whole different world. I don't know what it all means or what it adds up to. But when I look at an organization like Avaz and able to get 1.5 million signatures in one day, that's a very powerful impact. I don't know whether the collective impact of 1 million people pushing a button and registering is the same as people on the ground getting out, actually making contact with human beings. I just don't know. That's the kind of activism I think of, or leadership. And it's a different world.
For me, there's literature on this around the psychological distancing of climate change, geographically, temporally, conceptually. People just can't wrap their heads around it, and that has a psychological impact on inaction. It basically creates inaction because people just aren't connected to it. And so, these tools that I'm interested in ideally drive this action that we're looking for, because you've all seen Atlantic Canada, you've all seen the impact that this issue is having on people and humans, and you're connecting with them. And so I think there's a real power in digital video, obviously, and the democratization or hopeful democratization of the internet to share information, it's pretty amazing, and so I'm hopeful on those levels. And I was also reflecting on there was a Walrus magazine article where they talked about digital immigrants versus digital natives, and basically the new generation, young kids that, their first experience with, communication is something like an iPad, and they have the tools at their fingertips because they're these digital natives, where the rest of us are digital immigrants because we haven't ever really communicated with these tools. And I look at the university students that I teach, and they're amazing. They're absolutely hyper talented in their ability to share information and get information out, and I think there's a real opportunity here with this young generation to just completely take over the kind of information sphere because they're so good at it. And I'm kind of on that cusp generation where these tools are kind of within my means and within my kind of generational thinking, and yet the difference between me and my students, they're just blowing me away in my ability to kind of grasp these things, and that's only 10 years. And so I think as we see these things come online, that young generation will have a better opportunity to share their information, share their views, and command attention than, the old dusty farts out there.
I'll offer a quick answer. I mean, on the climate communication, Google climate access, and you can find some really sophisticated social science research on how, in fact, to message climate. To me, the challenge is not teaching communication, it's teaching collaboration. As long as people are trying to sell messages to us about climate change that will let us step in with very little effort or communal dimension to things, I think we're a little bit trapped. And it's actually by teaching people to include communities, to go out into communities to learn, to really see this as a collaborative project that we're going to get somewhere new.
My name is David Williamson. Dr. Suzuki, you hinted at electoral reform possibly to make our votes count. I'd love to see that. I'd like to know if it's what we can do to make that happen. I mean, we need better leadership. Harper is great for leading us into war, maybe. He's not so good in saving the environment. We need a regime change in Ottawa, and I'm wondering what you might suggest for electoral reform.
My name's Cameron. Thank you all for being here tonight. On the subject of the Leadership College and $35 million, just a quick statement off the top. I believe that leaders emerge. You can't really educate them so much, and one day we'll get over the idea that getting together in a box to think outside the box is the right thing to do. In a day when actually we're being penalized for doing the right things, such as setting up your own gray water system, solar paneling in the city, chickens, bees, etc. David, you've heard all this before. What does one do? I mean, every time it seems that we turn around to make a proper decision for ourselves and take the leadership to ourselves, that we're being stopped by some bylaw or some official or another. What do we do about this?
Thank you.
My name is Chloe. I'm an undergraduate ecology student, and I'm also interested in Canadian politics. And you mentioned the disconnect between environmental values and economic values when talking about things like how we value a forest. So my question is, how can citizens as leaders, especially people interested in politics, work to change the framework of those discussions and change the rules so that grassroots movements aren't perpetually at odds with provincial and federal government bodies in this country?
And a last question.
Hi, my name is Nadia, and I kind of have a comment/question. I grew up in Haiti in India, and my family worked with NGOs and socioeconomic community development. And one thing I noticed that I want to know if our panelists tonight think is applicable here is my understanding of what a leader is was shaped by my experiences growing up. And what I found was that a leader doesn't just inspire, a leader doesn't just educate, a leader doesn't just walk with people while they're learning a new skill. And a leader doesn't only help someone else develop capacity. A leader actually stays with a person until that person learns how to be a leader and learns how to do all those things as well. And that's the process of community development that I saw. And I think today here, we're all actually leaders. And however we want to engage in this dialogue, all we have to do is start. So I'd like to know if you guys agree with that.
Okay, so I'm going to suggest we move down the panel one more time and respond and wrap up.
Well, let me respond to the last question first, which is the only one I remember. So I agree with you. I think, you know, this obsession with leadership is not the way to go. One of the things I found in the ENGO community, environmental NGOs, is there's a limited pot that we're all fighting for. And so the backstabbing that goes on among NGOs is really ferocious. And I had a peace activist from the United States named Walt Taylor who sent me a little slogan. He said, you can achieve anything you want as long as you don't care who gets credit. And I have that posted on my wall, because the important thing is to be part of a movement. And yeah, some people will show leadership in certain ways, show initiative in other ways, but it's the collective impact that you're really interested in. I think that's what you were kind of saying. Well, tell us what the others are.
I agree with you as well. I especially agree with the idea that you stay with someone until they become leaders themselves. I don't think of myself as a leader, but people tell me that I am. So I'm trying to take what I do and I'm trying to pass that on to other people. And sometimes it's to actually people who are older than me, which is also a very strange situation. But, you know, ever since I've been given the privilege of being in a position of leadership, I haven't taken it to allow myself to get credit for all sorts of things. I've actually utilized it to try and bring other people from my community forward. And I'll get opportunities to go speak, and instead of taking that to sort of, you know, inflate my ego or my position as a leader, I often defer it to other people who I think are working in that process to become leaders themselves. And I think it's really, really, really important to do that. Because we need more leaders, and you can't take the weight on your shoulders and try and do it all on your own. One, you'll go crazy, and one, you'll never succeed because you'll constantly be trying to catch up with everything. So I really think that's a really important thing, that succession creates models of real success for change, and that we have to, you know, put that as a part of how the steps, strategic steps to making real change. And I wanted to talk about the enviro versus economic values. How do we change the rules? I think that that's starting to happen. You know, David came along with myself and my chief, Alan Adam, and we went on tour with Neil Young, and we had that concert, Honour the Treaties. And it really was talking about challenging this idea of environmental values versus economic values. Because when you look at what my community has done, which is, you know, we're being offered millions and millions of dollars from multiple, you know, companies, multinational companies all over the world, so that we could sell up tracts of land. And instead, what are we doing? We're saying, no, we don't want your money, and we're going to spend millions of dollars to fight you to come in here. And right now in Canada, the interesting thing that's happened is that we have, well, not we, the Harper government and the government of the day has gutted environmental legislation so bad that it's so difficult for individual Canadian citizens to really try and create accountability and put pressure on our governments to really see the value of the environment, because when you've removed all legislation to protect it, you no longer can see the value of it. And the one thing that the government of Canada can't do is they can't erode the treaties in this country. And so First Nations treaty rights have become one of the largest platforms and foundations for challenging those models of the governments of the day to continue business as usual and railroad the environment and destroy it along the way. And I think my nation is really trying to break this mold of, we no longer have to be economic hostages in this country anymore. We no longer have to be economic hostages in this race to industrialize this country, and that we have an opportunity to make real change. and that the value of our environments, of our waterways, of our air, the trees, of the forests, of the species is far more important than the millions of dollars these multinational companies are throwing out there. And we're seeing that duplicated in the fight against the Gateway Pipeline, and we're now starting to see it in the fight against the reversal of the Energy East pipeline that's going out east. Because, you know, as this beast, this Hydra type beast that is the tar sands, we have all these pipelines popping out everywhere. This new pipeline that's coming out, Energy East, we really need to be paying attention to it. They've given it a 15-month timeline because of the new NEB rules, and it is going to carry 1.1 million barrels per day. And that will lock us into tar sands expansion threefolds, and lock us into that for 50 to 100 years when we are supposed to be leaving 2/3 of the resources into the ground. It's absolutely imperative that that we break this mentality of being economic hostages, that the economy comes first. And we have to build those bridges and alliances and create new pathways forward. This week in DC, actually starting today, there's this big gathering called the CIA Gathering, or the Cowboy Indian Alliance. And they put a teepee encampment on the mall, and their cowboys and Indians in the United States have come together to send a message that they no longer want the Keystone XL. And my mom's really cute, and she said, we need to create the Canadian version of that. We can call it CSIS, the Canadian Settlers and Indigenous Solidarity. My mom is incredibly awesome and has, she raised me to be a part of this movement, and so I have to give her credit for that. And I really think that, when you're talking about what does one do to get past all of these policy reforms that are putting down the individual people, I think that it's about creating those new relationships and new alliances with sometimes strange bedfellows. One of the strangest allies for ACFN has been multinational corporations, because we have affected their bottom line so hard that they are now putting pressure on the Alberta government to change policies, in some cases to our favor, in some cases not. But I think it's really about being creative and carving out new pathways forward.
Lucky me, I get to go after Eriel Deranger. One of the things that kind of has been rattling around in my head, and I was telling David about this earlier, I interviewed Vandana Shiva a couple of years ago, and you can search it online, a conversation with Vandana Shiva, and one of the things that she told me, she said that one of the most important teachings she had in her activism was a sense of fearlessness, to not get beholden to fear and becoming afraid of reacting. And I think we live in a state right now where people are afraid to speak out. And I think that leadership is also about challenging leaders. And we have leadership in this country that needs to be challenged, and we should not be afraid to do so. And I think on that note, I'll stop.
Great.
Actually, I'd like to... Sorry, I can't help myself. It just had, on a lighter note, I remember when I started working on a national program, and there's no question whatever I've been able to achieve has been through the CBC, having a platform year after year. And in the mid-1970s, I was hosting a program called Science Magazine, and at that time, feminism, well, they called it Women's Lib back then, was all the big thing, and they started this hot new program called Some of My Best Friends, ... Our Pigs was the idea, and they gave a Porker of the Week award, and lots of publicity and all that, and I was so pissed off. I said, why? Science is way more important than this. Why aren't we getting more? And my boss, Jim Murray, said, the important thing is to hang in. They won't be around in another 2 years, but hang in there. And that's a really important lesson, I think, for all of us, is we've got to sustain the effort. And I look at Nelson Mandela as my great inspiration. I mean, in many ways, he set too high a bar, because I know damn well I'd be squealing the minute they brought torture at me. Okay, what do you want? I'll tell you. You know, but he hung in there, and that's really very, very admirable. And I'd like to end my statement with the most important lesson I got was when I was starting to work with Jim Murray in 1975 on a program called Science Magazine. And we went down to New Orleans where I was doing a film. And so I sat now I was a scientist at the time. I was doing this just for the hell of it. I was sitting on a stool, and the sound man comes in and hooks up the microphone. Lighting guy comes in and sets up all this takes a lot of time, and then finally the camera assistant comes in and sets up the camera, and then the cameraman walks in, and he had this habit. He would adjust the shot and then come over and take a light meter reading right at my nose, and then go back and adjust the shot, and he'd do this 7 or 8 times. Nothing's changed. And finally I said, "Rudy, for Christ's sake, shoot the goddamn thing." And Jim Murray, my boss, grabbed me and pulled me in another room, closed the door so the others wouldn't see me. He said, "Now listen, Suzuki, all those guys are busting their ass to make you look good, and that's not easy." And I realized when they see the film, I get credit for all that. Nobody knows, oh, look at the lighting the guy did, or isn't the sound great on. I get credit for all of that. And dozens of people go to making each film that is shown. And I get credit for all of that. And that's a very, very humbling thing. And I think for any leadership prospect, if you don't have a huge dose of humility, you're on the wrong track.
And so I would like to invite Will Campbell up, a Métis elder who would like to offer some closing thoughts. Will, please.
How does one say thank you to people who are as humble as they are, who put the amount of effort and the hard work that they do towards making a better life for tomorrow for our children? And when we talk about leadership, no one sets out to be a leader. We step forward when we're needed. That's what a leader is. Many years ago, my uncle, Ernie Tatusis, told me about things that would change. And I found it hard to believe the things that he talked about. Today I see that happening. One of the things he told me about was money. He said, "Will, money is created by human beings, and with it comes all the fault of human beings." And we see that. We see that to the point where we forget about the gifts that the Creator has given us, our children, in favor of money, in favor of having things that glitter, these little trinkets. I thank people like Dr. Suzuki. I remember many years ago when he first started on CBC, watching his show every night, every week, and learning, and to be amazed to be here, to thank him for his words. But I want to take a picture with you before you leave. And why I want to take this picture is last winter I was driving back to Winnipeg, and I stopped in this little town down in southern Saskatchewan to fuel up with gas, and there was a storm on. And a whole carload of my people pulled up the next gas pump. And all young guys, and they got out and they started saying, "Okay, Earl, it's your turn to pay for the gas," you know. Started fueling up. And Earl looked over at me, and he come walking over to me. And he said, "I want to shake your hand." He said, "I never thought I'd run into anybody as famous as you are in a storm. And he said, Dr. Suzuki is I looked at him, you know, and I had frost on my beard. And he thought I was this famous man. So I want to carry a picture. But that is one of the greatest honors I think I was given. Ian Mauro is my son-in-law. And I thank this young man for marrying my daughter. But most of all, I thank him for the hard work that he does. Many years ago in the 60s, I started making films. I was one of the first Native people in the industry. And I worked with a man called Tom Radford, who's a local filmmaker here in town. We did a show called Death of a Delta that talked about the effects of the Dene Dam on the people in the north. And that film was shown once, and it was stopped. It was never shown again. And I think of all of those people and the things that they said, those elders who have moved on at that time, and what is being said today. It hasn't changed much. So I want to thank you, Ian, for the hard work you do, for the voice that you bring to a movement that we need. And Eriel, what can I say? I am amazed. You know, many years ago when first time I heard the words grassroots, I was quite insulted. Because I said, I am not a grassroots. I'm not that low. Until I started to understand the context it was put in. To understand the honor and what it means to give to the sacred land, to believe in the gifts that the Creator has gave us, how we take for granted that simple breath of life, how we take for granted these gifts, the animals that have been given us, that are here to serve us, and most of all, the water, the first medicine, and how we are destroying all of this. For what? You are a powerful grassroots person. And I say that with all the respect that I have in the work that I have come to know over the years. So I want to thank John for his words earlier, powerful elder, for the leader and Grand Chief of our nation, Treaty 6, and for his words. And I want to thank our grandmothers and grandfathers that he called to be here with us. And I want to thank them now and ask them to go home now. So with that, if you'll stand, I'll say a prayer. I give thanks for this day. I give thanks for us coming together. I give thanks for the sharing of our words to one another that keeps our hopes and our dreams and our strength alive for our children. I give thanks for the wisdom of the elders. And I give thanks to you, Great Spirit, for guiding us and walking with us, for our relations who help us now that we need their help. And I pray that we find that strength to continue to work hard, to make change for the ones we love, for the little ones that are yet to come, that we prepare a place of good health aho mitapias. Thank you.
A quick reminder before I thank our guests and let you finally get out that door. This evening was a fundraiser for two very worthy local environmental causes. There are donation boxes outside as you leave, so if that wallet is feeling just a little bit heavy, you know what to do about it. So please join me in thanking our three panelists, the elders, and the Grand Chiefs. And so from all the sponsors of this evening, the City of Edmonton, the University of Alberta Office of Sustainability, APIRG, and Alberta Climate Dialogue, safe travels home.